In the heart of a bustling city, James Williams, a wealthy restaurant owner, finds himself in a life-threatening car accident that leaves him in a coma. As he awakens in the hospital, he overhears a conversation that shatters his world. His beloved wife, Grace, is conspiring with her lover, eagerly awaiting his demise to inherit his wealth. Pretending to remain unconscious, James endures the pain of betrayal, all while devising a plan to reclaim his life and justice. With the help of a kind-hearted nurse, Erica, he returns home to confront Grace, only to uncover even deeper treachery. Despite the heartbreak and exhaustion, James finds solace and new beginnings with those who truly care for him, including a homeless man named Connor, who saved his life. In the end, James discovers love in unexpected places and the strength to rebuild his life, surrounded by loyal friends and a brighter future. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. As the wealthy man slowly came to the sterile environment of the intensive care unit, a wave of confusion and dread washed over him. His senses, still dulled from whatever had brought him here, barely registered the faint hum of medical equipment surrounding him. Through the fog of his consciousness, he caught fragments of a conversation. His wife's voice, unmistakable in its tone, pierced through the haze. The words she spoke sent a chill down his spine. A will. His will. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. In an instant, a desperate plan formed in his mind. He would feign death, anything to buy time to process this betrayal. James's mind, still reeling from the shock, suddenly snapped into sharp focus, as though a switch had been flipped. His heart pounded in his chest, but his body refused to follow the commands his brain was frantically issuing. His eyelids, heavy and uncooperative, barely lifted, allowing him only a sliver of vision. The room was blindingly white, causing him to wince as the light seared his retinas. God, where am I? Why does my body feel so feeble, so utterly drained of life? How did I end up in this place? He whispered, the words barely escaping his parched lips. The answer was all around him: the soft, rhythmic beeping of machines, the steady drip of IV fluids into his veins. He was in a hospital, but how had he come to be here? The details were a blur, and the more he strained to remember, the more the searing light above him scattered his thoughts like broken glass. The shrill ringing in his ears only added to the chaos in his mind, drowning out any coherent thought. Then, like a dagger, a sudden, intense pain tore through his consciousness, forcing a low groan from his throat. The pain was overwhelming, yet it was nothing compared to the thirst that consumed him. His throat burned, dry as the desert, but there was no relief in sight, no nurse, no water within his reach, nothing. As he lay there, tethered to the bed by the myriad of tubes and wires snaking from his body, the reality of his situation began to set in. He had never been in a place like this before, an environment so cold, so clinical. The equipment around him seemed alien, menacing even, and his own body felt like it belonged to someone else, utterly beyond his control. His strength was sapped, and his vision was reduced to fleeting glimpses of the world through barely open eyes. At first, the sounds around him were muffled, as though he were underwater, but then a familiar voice cut through the din, filling him with a mix of fear and longing. It was Grace, his wife. Her voice, with its distinctive lilt and cadence, was unmistakable, stirring a flicker of hope in his heart, even as dread gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. James's body stiffened instinctively, every nerve on edge, as he strained to make even the slightest movement, desperate to catch Grace's attention. But before he could muster the strength, the soft creak of the door opening sent a shiver down his spine. His heart raced, dreading the conversation that was about to unfold. The last thing he expected to hear was what came next. "Dr. Merritt." Hello, Grace's voice greeted, deceptively sweet but laced with a hint of something darker. "Please tell me, how is my husband? Will he remain in this vegetative state, suffering endlessly? Perhaps it's time to consider more radical measures." Her tone was syrupy yet insincere, a sharp contrast to the words she spoke. A heavy silence hung in the air before the doctor responded, his voice grave. "I'll give you one piece of advice. Do not tempt fate. Hold on to hope, even if it's faint. Your husband's chances are slim, but giving up now would be a grave mistake. Also, you must minimize your time in this room to avoid the risk of introducing any infection. Should there be any change in his condition, we'll inform you immediately. For now, I strongly recommend you leave." Grace's reply came swiftly, her voice dripping with false remorse. "Of course, doctor, you're right. Forgive me." I understand her words were almost too polished, too rehearsed, as if she was performing a role she had prepared long before. James listened intently as the doctor's footsteps faded, the door closing behind him with a final click. But Grace did not leave. He could sense her presence, standing by his bedside, her mind no doubt churning with thoughts he could only guess at. Then, breaking the uneasy silence, the sharp trill of a phone echoed through the room, an alien sound in the sterile atmosphere of the ICU. It jarred James, making him question the reality of the situation. Eavesdropping was something James despised. It was beneath a man of his stature, a respected businessman, the owner of one of the city's finest restaurants. Had he been well, he would have left the room, granting Grace her privacy. But trapped in his own body, unable to move or speak, he was forced to listen. "Hello, darling. Is that you?" Grace's voice took on a tone he had never heard before, soft and affectionate, a tone that didn't belong to the woman he thought he knew. "Your number's unfamiliar. Did you change it again? The will?" "Yes, I've completed it, of course. It's exactly as I wanted. The notary made sure of it, though it wasn't cheap. But you know, everything comes with a price." James's heart pounded, each beat echoing the fury and disbelief building inside him. Who was she speaking to with such tenderness, such ease? The words about the will sent his mind racing. But what she said next shattered whatever hope he had left, confirming his worst fears. "Yes, darling, I'm in the room now. What can I say? My dear husband lies here like a vegetable, with no signs of change. This gives me the freedom to manage the restaurant as I wish. And when James is gone, I'll inherit everything just as planned. But for now, I need to go. I've got things to take care of. I love you. Goodbye for now." The finality of her words hit James like a physical blow. The woman he had loved and trusted, who now stood just inches from him, was plotting his demise with chilling detachment. The realization sent waves of cold fear through him, mingled with searing anger that he could not express, trapped as he was in a body that had betrayed him as completely as his wife had. The sheer audacity of Grace's words left James breathless, his mind reeling with shock and disbelief. How could she stand there mere inches from him and speak so callously about his impending death as if he were already gone? And to reduce him to nothing more than a vegetable, it was a cruelty he could scarcely comprehend. What had he done to deserve such heartless treatment from the woman he had trusted with his life? As James lay there, confined to the hospital bed, his thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He couldn't understand why the sensors, designed to alert the medical staff the moment he regained consciousness, had failed him. He had seen something like this in a movie once. He couldn't recall the title, but the plot had stayed with him. It was one thing to watch such a scenario unfold on screen, safely detached from the drama. But it was another thing entirely to live it, to be the one trapped, especially when the person betraying you was someone you had loved and trusted. The reality of Grace's betrayal cut deep, but amidst the pain and confusion, one burning question consumed his thoughts: who had saved him from the fiery wreckage of the car? Who had risked everything to pull him from certain death? Just as the weight of these questions threatened to overwhelm him, James's consciousness wavered, pulling him back into the memories of that fateful day. It started like any other, with the morning sun casting its golden light over the city. James Williams, a man of discipline and routine, had risen with the dawn, as he always did, while most of the city's residents still lay in the comfort of their beds. From the expansive windows of his home, he had a perfect view of the city, slowly waking up and slipping into its daily rhythm. His morning rituals were simple but deliberate. He prepared a breakfast that was both nutritious and satisfying: freshly squeezed orange juice, eggs quickly fried with crisp bacon, the scent filling the air with a comforting familiarity. Afterward, he spent a few minutes on his morning exercises, stretching his muscles and awakening his body fully for the day ahead. James prided himself on maintaining a healthy lifestyle, though he never imposed his habits on Grace. He believed in personal choice, understanding that everyone is different, and Grace was no exception. He, for instance, adhered strictly to a vegetarian diet, avoiding all animal products. Yet, he never judged those who chose differently, including his wife, who had never shown much interest in his dietary preferences. As he moved through the morning, everything had seemed ordinary, almost mundane. Little did he know that these small, everyday moments would soon be shattered by a betrayal so profound that it would alter the course of his life forever. The memory of that morning, with its quiet simplicity, now felt like a cruel joke, a stark contrast to the nightmare he found himself in now. The burning question of who had saved him lingered, but even more pressing was the realization that the life he had known, the trust he had placed in those closest to him, was irrevocably broken. With the tray of his freshly prepared breakfast in hand, James stepped out onto the spacious terrace, the crisp winter air greeting him as he took a seat at the table. The terrace, enclosed for the season, was a haven of warmth, with a small fireplace crackling softly in the corner, casting a cozy glow over the scene. The stillness of the early morning, coupled with the gentle crackle of the fire, provided a rare moment of peace for James, a man whose life was otherwise filled with constant motion. As he breathed in the fresh air, his thoughts turned to the day ahead. He mentally ran through his schedule, ensuring that every task and meeting would be handled with his usual precision. These quiet moments were when he often felt the sting of loneliness the most, with Grace still asleep, oblivious to the morning's quiet beauty. After savoring his breakfast, James dressed in his favorite business suit, the fabric tailored to perfection, and set off for work. It was his habit to arrive at the restaurant before the official opening, a practice rooted in his belief in leading by example. He liked to see who among his staff was punctual and who struggled with timekeeping. Though he didn't care for lateness, he was fair in his judgments, understanding that some had genuine challenges. Emma, the dishwasher, came to mind. Living on the far side of the city, she relied on an unpredictable bus route to get to work, a journey fraught with delays, especially on days when the weather turned foul. That particular day, the weather had taken a turn for the worse. Snow began falling in the early hours, at first gently, each flake swirling in the air before settling on the ground. But soon, the snow intensified, blanketing the city in a thick, white layer. James couldn't help but admire the beauty of the snowfall, even as he knew it would keep many customers away. Blizzards had a way of disrupting the city's rhythm, and on days like these, people preferred the warmth of their homes over a night out in a restaurant, no matter how inviting. As James parked his car near the entrance, he braced himself for the cold, pulling up the collar of his coat before stepping into the biting wind. The moment he left the warmth of his car, a sharp gust of wind slapped a handful of snow into his face, forcing him to quicken his pace. Henry, the elderly janitor, was already at work, battling the elements with his trusty shovel, clearing the steps just in time for the restaurant's opening. Seeing James approach, Henry paused, raising his hand in a friendly salute. "Good morning, Mr. Williams. The snow's come down today. It's going to keep us on our toes, that's for sure. Makes your bones ache in this cold." "Good morning," Henry James replied with a smile. "Are you out here tackling the snow all by yourself again? I told the security guard to give you a hand on days like this." But Henry, Ever the stubborn worker waved off the suggestion. "Oh, don't worry about it, Mr. Williams. I've got it covered. This is nothing for me, just a bit of exercise to get the old blood flowing. A few swings of the shovel, and I'm good as new." James chuckled at the older man's determination. "Exercise, you say? Well, how about you hand me that shovel, and I'll join you. Could use a warm-up myself before diving into the day." Despite Henry's protests, James insisted, taking the shovel from the janitor with a grin. It was in these small, unexpected moments when he connected with his staff on a personal level that James found a sense of fulfillment. Here, amidst the cold and snow, he was reminded of the simple joys in life, the camaraderie that could warm even the coldest day. Little did he know, this ordinary act of goodwill would be one of the last such moments of normalcy before everything in his life was turned upside down. Amid the swirling blizzard, passers-by couldn't help but double-take at the sight of James, the well-respected businessman, deftly shoveling snow from the steps of his restaurant. It was a sight that seemed almost surreal, a man known for his polished suits and successful ventures, now out in the cold, doing the work of a laborer with practiced ease. Henry, watching from the side, nodded approvingly. "I have to say, James, you're pretty handy with that shovel. Where'd you get all that practice?" James chuckled, the cold air turning his breath into puffs of white. "Oh, it's from my days in the village, at my grandfather's place on the outskirts. He had me working the land, and while I'm not much for hunting, I was always up for picking mushrooms, berries, or a good fishing trip. Those were the days." He paused, his smile softening as he glanced at Henry. "How are your grandkids doing, by the way? Have they grown up yet?" Henry sighed, a smile touching his lips. "My eldest grandson's off to university now, can you believe it? And the youngest is still finishing school. They're good kids, though hardworking, just like their grandpa." Pride and a hint of melancholy laced his voice, the familiar passage of time marked by the milestones of those he loved. As James finished up the impromptu snow clearing, he handed the shovel back to Henry with a grin. "You know, it's good to stay active. Keeps the mind sharp." They shared a brief laugh before James made his way inside, where the warmth of the restaurant quickly enveloped him. Inside, as the staff prepared for the day, James noticed Emma, the dishwasher, bustling about with her usual quiet efficiency. Despite the harsh weather outside, she seemed distracted, and James, always attentive to his employees, couldn't help but notice. "Emma," he called out gently, "is everything all right? You seem a bit preoccupied today." Emma hesitated, then forced a smile. "Oh, it's nothing, Mr. Williams. I am just worried about driving in this weather. You know how tricky it can be." James gave her a reassuring nod. "Don't worry about me. I've been driving for over 10 years and never had any issues. I never speed, so there's no need to fret. Accidents aren't on the agenda today." Despite his confident words, he could see the concern lingering in Emma's eyes, but she nodded and returned to her duties. As he turned to leave, heading towards his office, Emma hesitantly called after him. "Mr. Williams, can I ask you something?" James paused and turned back, his expression open and encouraging. "Of course, Emma. What do you need?" She hesitated, clearly gathering her courage before she spoke. "I was wondering if I could take home some of the dishes that the customers reject. Just a couple. I'll pay for them, of course. You can deduct it from my salary." James smiled warmly, touched by her humility. "Emma, there's no need to pay. Those dishes are just going to be thrown out anyway. You and your kids should benefit from them rather than letting them go to waste. Take as many as you need. It's not a problem at all." The relief and gratitude in Emma's eyes were unmistakable, and she quickly thanked him, the weight visibly lifting from her shoulders. This small act of kindness was a real stroke of luck for her, and James felt a quiet satisfaction in being able to help. James continued with his day, moving from one task to the next with his usual diligence. He discussed menus with the restaurant manager, prepped for an upcoming inspection, and handled the steady stream of phone calls that kept the business running smoothly. Yet, despite the busy schedule, Emma's words lingered in his mind. There was something about her cautious request, combined with her earlier concern, that struck a chord with him. Imagine that he mused to himself with a wry smile, a kitchen worker with a knack for fortune-telling. That's a first. But soon, the thought of a possible accident faded into the background, overtaken by meetings with new suppliers, taste-testing potential new dishes, and resolving the small disputes that naturally arose in a bustling restaurant. James had always believed in maintaining an atmosphere of trust and cooperation, and his approach had always been to resolve issues with a gentle hand, resorting to firmness only when necessary. The day moved on, filled with the familiar rhythms of his work, but beneath it all, there was a subtle undercurrent and awareness that something more significant might be at play, just beyond the edge of his consciousness. As the hours slipped away unnoticed, 3 had already gone by when James finally realized just how long he had been caught up in the fury of the storm that relentlessly battered the city. Though the tempest still howled with rage, its intensity had waned somewhat from the morning's terrifying assault. The city's tireless utility workers had remarkably regained control, clearing the main arteries of the town with surprising speed. With only an hour and a half left in the workday, James made an uncharacteristic decision: he would leave early. An idea had been brewing in his mind, a plan to turn this frigid February evening into something magical, something that would overflow with love and romance. He envisioned showering his beloved with a luxurious bouquet of roses, a fine bottle of wine, and an exquisite meal prepared with his own hands, straight from his restaurant's kitchen. The wine and dinner were easy enough to procure, but finding flowers in this snow-blanketed city proved to be a much more challenging ordeal. To James's deep frustration, nearly every flower shop he passed was shuttered, their owners likely assuming no one would venture out for flowers in such dreadful weather. Just as hope was beginning to fade, he caught sight of a small, dimly lit shop on the corner, its lights still flickering invitingly in the snowy gloom. A surge of relief washed over him as he quickly parked and hurried inside. The warm, fragrant air was heavy with the scent of roses, tulips, and the fresh vibrancy of imported mimosa. It reminded James that despite the snowstorm outside, spring and the beloved Women's Day just 2 weeks away was not far off. The shopkeeper, a pleasant young woman with a warm smile, swiftly helped him select the perfect bouquet. James's heart swelled with anticipation, knowing that a night of romance awaited him. Grace, his beloved, would surely be thrilled by his surprise. He could almost see her now, her eyes lighting up as he presented her with the bouquet. She rarely cooked for him, understanding that he could dine on gourmet meals at his restaurant whenever he pleased. So he carefully selected some fresh fruits, a bottle of champagne, and a couple of Chef Frank's mouth-watering dishes, prepared to perfection. When James finally arrived home, the last thing on his mind was ringing the doorbell. Instead, he quietly unlocked the door with his key, eager to surprise Grace. Soft music floated through the air from the direction of the bedroom. She must be engrossed in one of her favorite shows again, James mused, smiling as he headed to the kitchen to set down his bags. The bouquet, a symbol of his love, was left in the living room, to be presented with a flourish later in the evening. His heart was light, his spirit joyful, as he made his way toward the bedroom. But as he stepped through the door, the world seemed to shift around him. The bouquet slipped from his grasp, one of the roses shedding its delicate petals as it fell to the floor. The room was empty. Grace was not there. Panic gripped him as he realized the TV had been left on, playing in an empty room. Where could she have gone in such a storm? A cold dread settled over him as he remembered how uneasy she was behind the wheel in bad weather. His thoughts raced. Could she have ventured out to pick up something, or perhaps to run an errand? His heart pounded as he spun around, intent on checking the garage for her car. Just as he was about to dash out, the television news caught his attention. An urgent report broke through the regular programming. A car had skidded off the city bridge and plunged into the icy river below just half an hour ago. The driver, they said, was a young woman, inexperienced behind the wheel. James's breath caught in his throat, his heart slamming against his ribs in terror. "Oh God, no, it can't be. It just can't be," he whispered, his mind flashing back to the money he had transferred to her earlier that day, money meant for a new dress. Could she have gone out in this storm just to buy it? And then the horrifying realization struck him with the force of a tidal wave. What if it was Grace? James sped away like a man possessed, his heart pounding in sync with the roar of the engine. The icy road blurred beneath him as he raced toward the bridge, his mind consumed by fear and desperation. Twice his car skidded on the treacherous turns, but James's instincts and experience kicked in, allowing him to regain control each time. He had always known his car's capabilities, pushing it to the limit when necessary. But Grace? She had only recently begun driving, a gift he now bitterly regretted giving her. What had he been thinking? With just under 2 miles left to the bridge, his car skidded again, this time more violently. He slammed the brakes with all his might, but the pedal went lifeless under his foot. The brakes had failed. Panic surged through him as he faced an agonizing decision: should he swerve into the ditch or crash headlong into the small car parked at the roadside? Without hesitation, he chose the ditch. The car rolled violently, metal twisting and glass shattering until it finally slammed into a tree, leaving James dazed and trapped. The last thing he remembered before darkness claimed him was the acrid stench of gasoline leaking from the damaged fuel tank, a volatile mix that only needed the slightest spark to ignite. Now, as James lay in a sterile hospital room, the incessant beeping of life support machines echoed in his ears, a cruel reminder of the life hanging by a thread. His mind replayed the events of that night, and a crushing realization settled over him. He had made a devastating mistake. The girl who had plunged from the bridge into the icy river wasn't Grace. But when terror grips you so fiercely, reason becomes a distant memory, a whisper drowned out by the roar of panic. Only now, as he lay helpless, did the horrifying truth dawn on him. Grace had been meeting with her lover all along, valuing him above everything, even her husband. The weight of her betrayal was suffocating, pressing down on James's chest with a force he could barely withstand. And then, there was the will. How could he have been so blind? Grace had insisted he draw it up just a few months ago. At the time, it had seemed like a practical decision, nothing out of the ordinary. But in light of recent events, its significance took on a sinister hue. The thought of such a brazen betrayal gnawed at his consciousness, refusing to let him slip into the numbness he so desperately craved. Determined to survive, he made a decision: he would pretend to remain in a coma, his only defense against whatever Grace might do next. He could feel her presence in the room, her cold, piercing gaze boring into him as if she could willing him to die with just a look. Her hands itched to press a few buttons, to end his life with a simple act of cruelty. The temptation was so strong that her hands trembled, her lips forming a thin, merciless line. The most painful realization was that he could do nothing to stop her, no way to prevent her from carrying out her plan. The danger was so palpable that it was as if he could feel death breathing down his neck once more. But just as the tension reached its peak, the sound of high heels clicking on the hospital's concrete floor echoed down the corridor. Grace froze, her murderous intent disrupted. A moment later, the familiar, calming voice of the attending doctor filled the room, a lifeline pulling him back from the brink. "Oh, it's truly unbelievable," Dr. Merritt remarked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "She's practically ready to bury him alive. Can you imagine? Why do people even marry such vipers?" There was a brief pause before his conversation partner, with a knowing tone, replied, "Well, what do you expect? They say this patient owns a top-tier restaurant in the city and has a substantial will." The tone and manner of the speaker made it clear to James that she was a nurse. Dr. Merritt then moved closer to James's bed, his eyes narrowing as he observed the equipment. "Strange," he muttered. "Some of these sensors seem to be malfunctioning, Erica. We might need to call in a specialist to get to the bottom of this. Still, it's going to take time for him to come out of this coma, but I believe he'll defy the odds and prove that miracles can indeed happen in cases like this." Erica, the nurse, nodded in agreement, her gaze following the doctor as he left the room. She then turned her attention to the finicky sensors. But before she could fix anything, a faint whisper broke the silence. "Water, give me water." Startled by the suddenness of it, Erica nearly jumped. "So, you're awake? Why didn't you signal?" she asked, her voice a mix of surprise and relief. James, mustering what little strength he had, whispered back, "Please, don't tell anyone that I've regained consciousness. We can't fool the attending physician, but let's keep this between us, at least for today." Erica hesitated. The request was unusual, but given everything she had observed about his wife's behavior, it didn't seem entirely out of place. "All right," she whispered back, "I'll do what you ask, but you can't drink anything just yet. The best I can do is moisten your lips." James closed his eyes in weary acceptance, knowing she was right. A few minutes later, he felt the cool touch of a damp cotton swab against his parched lips, the moisture a small, yet significant, relief. Desperate for even the smallest drop of water, James parted his lips slightly to absorb the liquid from the cotton. It wasn't much, but he didn't push for more. The important thing was that he was alive, that he hadn't perished in that fiery wreck. As these thoughts swirled in his mind, Erica set up an IV drip to nourish his weakened body. Seeing her care and determination brought tears of gratitude to James's eyes. She was doing everything she could to help him, despite the difficult circumstances. "No," he vowed silently, "they won't get my will or my inheritance. I will recover, and Grace won't see a single penny in the divorce." The resolve in his thoughts grew stronger, each one reinforcing his determination to survive and reclaim his life. Swallowing the lump in his throat, James allowed his eyes to close, finally surrendering to a deep, restful sleep. Meanwhile, Erica made her way to Dr. Merritt's office to report the unexpected development. The doctor listened intently, his face serious but understanding, knowing that his nurse was acting out of genuine concern for the patient. "Don't worry, Erica," Dr. Merritt assured her. "I won't tell his wife about the progress. If I were in her shoes, I'd be praying for his recovery day and night, but that woman only seems interested in securing her inheritance. Thank you for being so vigilant and doing your job so well." A warm, appreciative smile lit up Erica's face. It wasn't that James held any special attraction for her, it was simply that her desire to help others outweighed everything else. Meanwhile, across town, Grace had taken it upon herself to begin managing the restaurant in James's absence. With her fiery red hair and an air of ruthless determination, she cut through the staff like a whirlwind, imposing her will without a second thought. Knowing that James had been in a coma for 3 weeks now, she saw this as the perfect opportunity to assert control over his business. Her cold, piercing gaze met each employee with a mixture of indifference and disdain, making it clear that she had little regard for them as individuals. The head chef was the first to feel the sting of Grace's new management style, receiving a sharp reprimand and a hefty fine for using ingredients that she deemed too expensive. "Mrs. Williams, with all due respect, the quality of ingredients directly impacts the quality of the dishes we serve." He tried to reason, his voice tinged with frustration, but Grace's face flushed with anger, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "Don't you dare talk back to me," she snapped, her voice icy. "What I say is final. From now on, all decisions are mine. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to try your luck at a roadside diner. Your so-called talents might be more appreciated there." The head chef, his spirit crushed, lowered his head in resignation. "Yes, Mrs. Williams, I understand," he replied gloomily. Watching the exchange with a smug expression, Andrew, the restaurant's administrator, couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. He much preferred this new, ruthless version of management over the softer, more empathetic approach James had taken. Grace's aggressive tactics resonated with him. Approaching her with the subtlety of a jackal circling a lion's feast, he suggested slyly, "Mrs. Williams, if I may, have you considered using hidden surveillance cameras for added control?" Grace turned to him with a glint of interest in her eyes, clearly impressed. "Do we have those installed here?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Andrew smiled, pleased with himself. "Of course we do." Mr. Williams had them installed, though he rarely bothered to watch the footage only in cases of absolute necessity. The cameras are usually off, but since the accident I've kept them running. It's fascinating to see who thrives under real pressure. Unlike your husband's lax management. But with you in charge, things are going to be different. Grace beamed at Andrew, clearly appreciating his cunning. "Well done, Andrew. Your suggestion is invaluable," she praised, her tone brimming with approval. Andrew's satisfaction was evident as Grace immediately set the cameras to record, eager to monitor every movement of her staff. At first, nothing out of the ordinary caught her attention. Waitresses scurried around the dining room, the head chef barked orders in the kitchen, and the waiter greeted guests at the door. Everything seemed routine until Grace's eyes landed on yesterday's footage of a young dishwasher, Emma, lugging a bulky bag. Well, Grace muttered to herself, a sinister smile creeping across her lips. What could she possibly be carrying in that bag? Stealing from under my nose, no doubt, and my foolish husband let it happen. Fueled by suspicion, Grace decided then and there to catch Emma in the act. "Let's see how you explain yourself when I confront you," she thought, her mind already concocting scenarios of the impending showdown. Unbeknownst to her, poor Emma had been under close surveillance for some time, completely unaware that every move she made was being scrutinized. The hours crawled by, the tension building as the inevitable moment of reckoning approached. As her shift came to an end, Emma gathered a few leftovers, as she had done many times before with James's approval, and headed towards the exit. She had always been grateful for the small kindness he had shown, allowing her to take home untouched dishes that would otherwise go to waste. But today, things were different. Grace, waiting with a predatory gleam in her eye, intercepted Emma at the doorway, her voice dripping with triumph. "And where do you think you're going, sweetheart? Packed a bag full of delicacies and thought you could just waltz out of here." Emma froze, her heart sinking as she looked into Grace's cold, calculating eyes. Desperation and sadness welled up in her gaze as she stammered, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Williams, but I haven't stolen anything. These are just leftovers, the ones that were paid for but never touched by the customers." Grace's lip curled in disdain, her gaze hard and unforgiving. "Leftovers, you say? How convenient," she sneered, her voice laced with contempt. The once timid and grateful Emma now found herself trembling under the weight of Grace's accusations, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way to explain, to defend herself against this unjust onslaught. But deep down, she knew that no matter what she said, Grace had already made up her mind. The businesswoman's sneer deepened, dripping with contempt. "Untouched, you say? And who decided that? Was it you, sweetheart? You've certainly set yourself up with quite the arrangement, haven't you? Let's see what we've got here. Oh, a Caesar salad, and even though it's only half, that hardly changes the fact. Does it? You've got a real taste for the finer things, haven't you, dear?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, her heart sinking as Grace's harsh words twisted the situation beyond recognition. This was a nightmare she hadn't seen coming. "Oh, don't start with the tears," Grace snapped, her voice cold and merciless. "Your crocodile tears mean nothing to me, understand? Once you're out of a job, you can cry all you want, every minute of every day if it pleases you." Emma, her spirit crushed, sniffled as she fumbled through her bag, trying to find anything that might prove her innocence. The irony was almost too much to bear. Just half an hour ago, she had paid for these dishes with what little was left of her future salary. Now she faced the humiliating prospect of losing her job over a theft she hadn't committed. "Oh, look who we've caught in the net, Fisher, is it?" How fitting, the administrator Andrew chimed in with a smug grin as he approached. Grace exchanged a knowing glance with him, a silent agreement passing between them before she resumed her verbal assault on Emma. "But I wasn't taking it for myself," Emma pleaded, her voice trembling. "It was for the kids." Grace's expression hardened even further, her tone dripping with disdain. "Don't you dare try to play the sympathy card with me? I couldn't care less how many brats you have, 3, 4, 5, it's not my problem. You brought them into this world, so deal with it yourself." Andrew, eager to curry favor with Grace, added helpfully, "She's got 2 of her own and 2 more from her husband's first marriage." Emma's shoulders slumped as she muttered through her tears, "They're all mine. As for what my husband left behind, well, that's on him. He's in prison now, caught stealing. He thought having the kids would reduce his sentence, but I fought to get his rights revoked." But Grace was unmoved by Emma's story. To her, Emma was nothing more than a convenient scapegoat, someone she could use to demonstrate her newfound authority over the staff. Emma had simply been unlucky enough to get caught in the crossfire. "Well, Fisher, isn't it?" Grace said, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You're fired. Get out of my sight and take your sob story elsewhere." She gestured dismissively toward the door, her eyes devoid of any sympathy. Emma stood there, stunned, her mind reeling from the sudden and brutal dismissal. It felt as though her entire world had been ripped out from under her. Was she being discarded like an unwanted stray? Andrew, not wanting to miss his opportunity to kick someone when they were down, delivered the final blow. "Oh, and don't expect to see any of your salary. It's going to cover the damages you've caused." The news was a devastating blow, leaving Emma reeling with the realization that she had been completely betrayed by those she thought she could trust. With tears streaming down her face, she stepped outside, the bitterly cold wind biting at her heated cheeks. The moment Henry, the elderly janitor, saw her distress, he couldn't just stand by. He approached her gently, his heart aching for the poor woman. "Shh, there, don't cry, sunshine. Don't torment yourself over this," he said softly, wrapping his arm around her fragile shoulders. "You know Andrew's only doing as he pleases because he's in Grace's favor right now. But mark my words, once Mr. Williams recovers, Andrew's reign will come to an end. And in the meantime, so you don't go completely without, I'll set aside some money from my pension for you. You can pay it back whenever you can, no rush." Emma looked up at Henry, gratitude shining through her tears. "Thank you, Henry. Your kindness means more to me than I can say. I was counting on that money to make ends meet. We're barely scraping by as it is, what with the kids and the rent going up every month. The landlady keeps raising it, saying you get child benefits, so you won't be poor." Her voice broke as she fought to keep her composure. Henry shook his head in sorrow, his heart heavy with sympathy for Emma. She was a good woman, hardworking and kind, never one to speak ill of others. She spent her days elbow deep in hot, soapy water, scrubbing dishes until her hands were raw, and yet she never complained. And now, to see her treated so cruelly was almost too much to bear. As he comforted Emma, Henry's thoughts drifted back to Andrew. He remembered the man from his days as a student at the high school, where Henry had taught woodworking for over 40 years. Even then, Andrew had been a troublemaker, an arrogant bully who enjoyed tormenting those who were poorer or weaker than him. Henry had tried to correct him, to teach him the value of kindness and respect, but it had been in vain. The memory of that night when the woodworking shop had burned to the ground still haunted Henry. Though many had blamed him, accusing him of carelessly leaving a cigarette smoldering, Henry had never smoked a day in his life. He had always been meticulous about fire safety. The real culprit had been Andrew, who had set the fire with a group of his equally reckless friends. But Henry hadn't been able to prove it, and as a result, he had been unjustly fired, his reputation tarnished with a black mark on his employment record. Now, years later, Henry saw the same cruel streak in Andrew, and it pained him to think that good people like Emma were suffering because of it. But as he held her close, offering what little comfort he could, Henry vowed silently that he would do whatever it took to help her through this. The world might be full of people like Andrew and Grace, but it was also filled with people like Emma, and for them, Henry knew he had to keep fighting. The craft teacher, now long retired, had weathered his dismissal without much bitterness. By that time, his career had already wound down, and he wasn't left wanting for his daily bread. 17 years had passed since that fateful night, and by a twist of fate, Henry Brooks, the elderly janitor, crossed paths with Andrew once more. But this time, their roles were starkly different. Andrew, now in a position of authority, pretended not to recognize his former teacher. But Henry was no fool. He had seen too much of life to be deceived by Andrew's feigned ignorance. It was James who had truly earned Henry's respect, a leader who was honest, kind, and fair, embodying the qualities Henry admired. Clutching the money Henry had given her, Emma walked slowly toward the bus stop, hoping to catch her bus in time. The remnants of the recent snowstorm lined the street with dirty gray mounds, a stark reminder of the harsh winter. Lost in her thoughts, she trudged along, her mind heavy with the events of the day, when suddenly she heard a faint, muffled noise. Startled, she turned around, half expecting to see Henry following her with some last words of comfort. But the street behind her was empty, the cold air biting at her nose and cheeks, as if mocking her distress. The sound came again, this time more clearly, and Emma realized it was coming from a nearby snowdrift. Concerned, she cautiously approached, her heart pounding as she neared the source of the noise. There, half buried in the dirty snow, lay a man with a bloody head, barely conscious and groaning softly. The sight froze Emma in her tracks. Her first thought was that he was a drunk who had taken a nasty fall, but as she leaned closer, she could see he was sober, injured, yes, but not intoxicated. Without a second thought, Emma bent down and grabbed him under the armpits, struggling to lift his dead weight. He began to stir, his eyes fluttering open as he mumbled incoherently, "Damn, how could this happen? Bastards, don't touch Jack." His words were disjointed, a product of his delirium. Ignoring the nonsensical muttering, Emma focused on getting him to safety. She knew the cold could be deadly, especially for someone in his condition, and so she half-dragged, half-carried him towards Henry's shed. When Henry saw Emma returning, flushed and breathless, supporting the injured man, he immediately understood the situation without needing to ask. Together, they managed to get him inside and onto a makeshift bed, a worn-out folding sofa that Henry kept in the shed. "Well, that's a bit better," Henry sighed, relief washing over him as he began to tend to the man's head wound. He pulled out an old first aid kit, rummaging through it for bandages, cotton, and antiseptic. "Can you handle this?" "Shouldn't we call an ambulance?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with worry. But Henry shook his head calmly. "No need, dear. Let's not distract the paramedics from more urgent cases. I once dreamed of becoming a doctor, you know," he said, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "I even tried for medical school but didn't pass the entrance exams. Spent a year and a half training as a nurse too, but fate had other plans. Ended up as a laborer instead, but I know enough to give first aid. Don't worry, this lad is tough. He's seen the rough side of life. He'll pull through. You'll see." As Henry carefully dressed the wound, Emma watched in silence, her mind still reeling from the day's events. The compassion and care Henry showed reminded her that there were still good people in the world, even in the face of so much cruelty. The man on the cot stirred again, his groans growing quieter as the pain eased slightly. For now, he was safe, and that was enough. Emma's face immediately softened into a warm, sweet smile as the wounded man began to stir, his eyes fluttering open, and his head slowly turning as he tried to grasp where he was. "Take it easy, buddy. Take it easy. Sudden movements aren't a good idea right now. Just lie back and let yourself recover." "Do you remember your name?" Henry asked gently, his voice filled with concern. The young man forced a smile despite the pain. "Of course I do. It's Connor. Connor Sawyer. Got beaten up because of a dog. Some rich kids were looking for trouble, and they picked on the dog, Jack. He's just a street dog, hangs around the meat market, doesn't bother anyone. When I saw what they were doing, I couldn't just stand by. I managed to take down 2 of them, but the third one hit me on the head with something hard." Henry nodded sympathetically, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding of the world's cruelty. "Yeah, that kind of thing happens more often than it should. Don't worry about anything now. You're safe here. Stay as long as you need. I've got firewood and a little stove. You'll be as comfortable as possible." Connor looked gratefully at Emma, who had gone out of her way to help him when she could have just passed by. She glanced at her watch and sighed, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Well, it looks like I'll have to take a taxi now. There goes my savings. I've already missed the bus." Connor's face fell, guilt flooding his expression. He turned his head away, staring at the wall. Feeling responsible for her situation, he muttered, "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. It's just been one thing after another lately. About 3 weeks ago, I pulled a guy out of a burning car. Maybe you heard about it. It was all over the news." Emma paled at his words, her mind flashing back to the moment she learned about Mr. Williams's fate. She involuntarily looked at her palm, a reminder of the connection to the man who had once been her employer. Henry responded before Emma could find her voice. "We did hear about that, Connor. That man you saved, he was the owner of the restaurant where Emma and I worked." Emma corrected softly, her voice tinged with lingering pain. "We don't work there anymore. At least I don't." Connor shook his head, his face contorting slightly with pain as a spasm shot through his stiff neck. "Easy, my friend," Henry cautioned, placing a hand on Connor's shoulder to steady him. "For saving James, you deserve our deepest thanks. He's a good man, was, and probably still is." Connor shrugged slightly, a modest gesture that belied the gravity of what he had done. "I was just in the right place at the right time. It's not my territory, you see. We vagabonds have our own rules, dividing the city into districts and yards. Step into someone else's area, and you're likely to get your ribs cracked as a warning. But that day, I saw the accident. There was smoke rising and people were panicking, but no one was doing anything to help. The gas tank was about to blow," he began, recounting the harrowing experience. Henry listened intently, his respect for Connor growing with each word. Deep down, Henry had already decided that Connor was a good man after all. Who else would risk everything to save a stray dog or rush into danger to save a stranger? Connor took a deep breath, gingerly touching the wound on his temple, and continued. "When I saw that the driver could burn alive, I didn't hesitate. I ran straight to the car, grabbed a cobblestone, and smashed the window. I started pulling him out, but all around, people were just shouting, warning me that the gas tank was going to explode. They were right, but I couldn't just leave him there. I managed to drag him about 10 meters away, and then it blew." As he spoke, Emma and Henry both felt a profound sense of admiration for this man who had risked his life without a second thought. Connor's story was one of courage and sacrifice, of doing what was right even when it meant putting himself in harm's way. In that moment, The three of them shared a silent understanding, one forged in the fires of adversity and bound by the unspoken respect that comes from witnessing true bravery. "You, my friend, are a true hero," Henry said with a heavy heart, his voice filled with admiration. "To throw yourself into the fire for our James like that, it's something not many would do." Emma, too, looked at Connor with warmth and a growing sense of connection. The thought struck her that everything happening seemed far from coincidental. Connor had saved James, and now she had saved Connor. It was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss all this as mere chance. Knowing she couldn't delay any longer, Emma reluctantly called a taxi to take her home, where four hungry children, Nathan, Anna, Peter, and Emily, were eagerly waiting for her return. As she left, her thoughts were heavy with the day's events and the strange sense of fate that seemed to be weaving their lives together. Meanwhile, James lay in his hospital bed, slowly regaining his strength. His recovery was still tenuous. He could barely manage to hold a spoon or fork on his own. Erica and Dr. Merritt had kept their word, expertly deceiving Grace for nearly 5 days. During that time, Grace had been itching to disconnect James from life support and claim the inheritance she believed was rightfully hers. On the 5th day, James signaled Erica to come closer. His voice was weak but determined as he made an unexpected request. "I need to leave for a short while. You understand?" The nurse looked at him in disbelief, wondering if he was serious. Less than a week ago, he had emerged from a coma, and now he was talking about leaving the hospital as if it were nothing. "No, James, I'm sorry, but I can't take that kind of responsibility," Erica objected, her voice firm. "What if something happens to you? What am I supposed to do then? Stand trial?" Desperation flashed in James's eyes. "Please, Erica, help me. I'm begging you. I'll sign any document you need, acknowledging the risks and absolving the clinic of any responsibility." Erica hesitated, her thoughts racing. She knew she should refuse. This was far too risky. But she also couldn't forget how Grace had treated James, practically salivating at the thought of getting rid of him. Grace's cold-heartedness and her lack of hesitation in choosing methods and accomplices weighed heavily on Erica's conscience. Finally, she relented, albeit with a condition. "All right, I'll help you, but only if we go together. It'll be safer for both of us that way. We'll leave in the evening, just a couple of hours before lights out." James's eyes lit up with relief and gratitude. "Agreed. Thank you, Erica. But let's keep this between us, okay? Not even Dr. Merritt should know. No one must know." Erica nodded, though she knew she was stepping into a dangerous game. The risks were high, but her empathy for James and her disdain for Grace outweighed her fears. James's trust in her, his hopeful gaze as he looked into her eyes, made her resolve even stronger. This secret plan would have to be executed flawlessly, with no room for error. As she left his bedside, Erica couldn't help but wonder what James's true intentions were, and whether this impromptu escape would bring him the justice he deserved or lead to further complications. But one thing was certain: she was committed to seeing this through, no matter the outcome. Erica nodded, her face set with determination as she began to gather everything necessary for their risky plan. She packed emergency medications, just in case, and discreetly borrowed a walking stick from one of the clinic's patients, hoping it would help James manage the strain of the escape. Meanwhile, James lay on the bed, trying to muster the strength he needed for what lay ahead. His thoughts drifted to Emma, and he couldn't stop the tears that welled up in his eyes. She was right all along, he thought bitterly. She saw it so clearly, and I was too blind, too foolish to believe her. Now I'm paying for that mistake. And Grace, she's got a lover in her eyes on everything I've worked for. But I'll deal with her, not with the same cruelty she's shown, but I'll make sure she gets what she deserves. As the hours dragged on, time seemed to stretch unbearably. Finally, Erica appeared in the ward with a set of clean clothes, signaling that there was no turning back. "Here, put these on," she said gently, handing him the clothes. They belong to my ex-husband. We've been divorced for a long time, and he never came back for them. I think they'll fit you just fine." James dressed as quickly as his weakened body allowed, each movement a painful reminder of the injuries he was still recovering from. His steps were unsteady, and he had to stop every few hundred feet to catch his breath. Erica was patient, understanding his limitations, and did everything she could to support him, guiding him carefully and ensuring they stayed out of sight as much as possible. She had arranged for a private driver, someone discreet who wouldn't ask questions about a weary man leaning heavily on a walking stick. When they finally arrived at James's home, a wave of anxiety washed over him, his heart pounding loudly in his chest. Erica looked at him with concern, but they both knew it was too late to turn back. James had to see this through. Only by confronting Grace would all their efforts be justified, and the truth finally come to light. As James stepped out of the car, the cold wind bit into him, causing him to shiver. He approached the front door, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He still had his keys. They had been with him at the time of the accident, along with his wallet and smartphone. But as he inserted the key into the lock and tried to turn it, he realized with a sinking feeling that it no longer fit. "Grace must have changed the locks," James whispered, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "She adapted quickly to her new reality, didn't she?" He slipped the useless key back into his pocket and pressed the doorbell. The familiar trill of the melody filled the air, a sound that once brought comfort but now felt mocking. Erica stood a short distance away, watching silently, her face etched with worry. Moments later, footsteps echoed from within the house, and the door swung open. James's heart clenched as he saw the figure standing before him, Grace's lover, smug and confident, dressed in James's bathrobe. It wasn't just any bathrobe, it had been a gift from James's late mother, something that held sentimental value. And now this man was wearing it as if it were his own, without a shred of conscience. The sight of him standing there so casually, as if he owned everything, ignited a fire within James. This was the man who had not only taken his wife but dared to take over his home and his life. The man's eyes widened slightly in surprise when he saw James, but there was no fear, no guilt, just a cold, calculating look, as if he were already thinking about his next move. The man leaned casually against the doorframe, a smirk playing on his lips. "Out," he replied coolly. "But I suppose you already knew that, didn't you? Otherwise, you wouldn't be here." James clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. "Tell her I'm back," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "and that I'm not going anywhere." The man's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "We'll see about that," he muttered, stepping back and closing the door in James's face. James stood there for a moment, the cold wind whipping around him, before turning back to Erica. She could see the pain and determination in his eyes, the resolve to reclaim what was his, no matter the cost. "We're not done yet," James said quietly, his voice firm. "This is just the beginning." Erica nodded, her resolve hardening. Together they would face whatever came next. The battle was far from over, but James wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. Stunned by the audacity of the scene before him, James stood frozen, his eyes locked in a cold, defiant stare at Grace's lover. Just as James was about to respond, he heard Grace's voice drift from behind the man, lazy and unconcerned. "Who's at the door, darling? Not the utilities again, I hope. I've paid everything in advance for the month so we could relax at the resort." James's face paled as rage simmered beneath the surface. His fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Grace, seeing him and understanding everything in an instant, dropped to her knees without shame, even in front of her lover. "James, please forgive me," she begged, her voice desperate. "It's not what you think, I swear. I thought you had only a few days left. The doctor didn't give any hope, and I never believed in miracles. But here you are, darling, alive." James ground his teeth, his voice a low growl as he cut her off. "I'll give you 5 minutes to gather your things and get out of this house." Grace's lover, unfazed by the tension, straightened his broad shoulders and smirked mockingly at James. "Listen, you broken-down businessman, go back to the hospital where you belong and stop meddling in normal people's lives. Honestly, it's a pity you didn't crash back then." James's grip tightened around the handle of his cane, his anger barely contained. "You won't have to wait long to regret those words, you bastard. You thought you'd buried me alive, but I survived, against all odds. And I'm certain the accident wasn't an accident at all. I'll uncover the truth if it's the last thing I do." At the mention of this, the cocky bravado drained from the lover's face. He slinked back into the house to change, knowing the charade was over. The fantasy he had indulged in with Grace, filled with dreams of easy wealth, was crumbling, and now the reckoning had begun. Though James had no concrete proof of Grace's involvement in the crash, he knew how to hit her where it hurt. He immediately froze all her accounts and blocked access to any assets she might have claimed. Once, he had lifted Grace out of her provincial obscurity, shaping her into the businesswoman she pretended to be. But after this betrayal, forgiveness was impossible. He remembered how he had once saved her from a criminal fraud charge, naively believing in her innocence. But the truth was, she had always been a ruthless opportunist, driven solely by greed. As these thoughts raced through his mind, Grace, in a panic, grabbed a heavy vase, intending to smash it over James's head. But Erica, who had been watching closely, intercepted her in the nick of time, seizing her arm and stopping the attack. At that very moment, several police cars pulled up to the house, and officers in plain clothes, armed and ready, poured out. For Grace and her lover, the game was up. As they were handcuffed and led away, James watched them with a mixture of sadness and relief. But the adrenaline that had kept him standing finally gave out, and he collapsed from sheer exhaustion. If not for Erica, he might have fallen into another coma, but she was there to catch him, easing him gently to the ground. James didn't hear the wail of the approaching ambulance as consciousness slipped away. When he woke the next morning, he was disoriented by the muffled voices around him. But this time it wasn't Grace scheming with her lover over his will. Instead, the voices belonged to his loyal friends Henry, the janitor Emma, the dishwasher and Connor, the man who had saved his life. As James's vision cleared, he recognized Connor, the street hero who had pulled him from the burning car, the man who had chosen anonymity over recognition. Connor, with a shy smile, explained that he had disappeared out of fear of drawing too much attention. As he spoke, James felt a wave of gratitude and a deep sense of kinship with these people who had come to mean so much to him. He found himself thinking that Connor would make an excellent manager for the restaurant, a role that required both bravery and integrity, qualities Connor had in spades. As for Emma, her tireless work ethic and kindness earned her a promotion. Whether she chose to be a waitress, an assistant chef, or something else entirely, James was ready to support her in whatever way she needed. But first, there was something James needed to do, something that had been growing in his heart through all the trials of the past weeks. He wanted to express his feelings to Erica, the nurse who had not only saved his life, but had also kindled a light in his heart. With everyone gathered around, he turned to Erica, his voice filled with emotion. "Erica, through all of this, you've been my strength. I can't imagine facing the future without you by my side. Will you stay with me, not just as my nurse, but as something more?" Tears welled up in Erica's eyes, and her response brought a storm of applause from those present. "Yes, James, I will. But please, let's try to stay away from hospitals in the future," she said with a gentle smile, her eyes shining with both love and relief. Connor, catching the sentiment in the air, subtly winked at Emma, hinting that he too was ready to step into a new role, not just as a friend, but perhaps as a father figure to her 4 children, or maybe even 5 someday. Who knew what the future held? But one thing was certain: with mutual respect and love, Everything else, weddings, pregnancies, the joyful laughter of children, would fall into place naturally, just as it was meant to be. As we come to the end of this incredible story, we've seen how resilience, courage, and the power of genuine human connection can overcome even the darkest of times. From betrayal and hardship to redemption and new beginnings, each character showed us that true strength comes from within, and that love and loyalty can prevail against all odds. So, what have you learned from this journey? We invite you to reflect and share in the comments below what's one lesson you've taken away from this story that you'll bring into your own life. Whether it's the importance of standing up for what's right, the value of loyalty, or the power of second chances, we'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring stories and life lessons. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more content that resonates with your heart.